Okay. Over to you.
That's great. Thanks for a wonderful introduction, Tom.
This is the microphone.
Okay, so my name is Karen, and thanks for that introduction, Tom. So I'm an environmental engineer at Durham University, and as Tom says, I'm kind of straddling science. I did science as my undergrad, and then a PhD in environmental engineering. Straddling science and engineering, and that is important for coming up with solutions, I think, to some of the problems, some of the global challenges that we have. So when I say nature-based systems, I mean working with nature, working with the microbiome, as we're going to be talking about a little bit. And I have to fess up and say it's pretty much all about soil and putting soil at the heart of the circular economy. The reason why I would suggest doing that is because we know from a lot of work that's been done that we can link soil health to all of the 17 SDGs directly, in some cases, indirectly in other cases. But there are publications out there showing how good soil health, healthy, sustainable terrestrial ecosystems are underpinning all 17 SDGs. It's great to see more people.
Yeah, I've seen it.
Yeah.
I just admit that.
So I can't talk about all of these today. I am obviously going to be talking about SDG 15, life on land, and also SDG 13, climate action, and of course SDG 12, circular economy, as well as good health, not just soil health, but human health and planetary health. So if we look at, taking a step backwards here, the definition that I usually adhere to for sustainable development, I think about the fact that we have economy. No, this is not clicking forwards. That's all right. So the economy is basically how we manage our resources, whether we manage them in a linear fashion or a circular fashion. If we think about the economy in those broader terms, it's management of resources. But of course, economy is determined by society. Most of us have similar economies these days, but we do have different types of economies that are possible within society. So definitely society is encapsulating that economy. But of course, the biggest thing that we know is that the environment is the rate limiting factor, the hard boundary that we're up against in our society and with our economy. So this would be my definition of sustainable development, is that development that is within these bounds. So it's an economy that operates within the limits of society and flourishes within the limits of nature. At the minute, of course, we have this linear industrial economy. What we need to do is to, and this is what I teach my engineers, they're in charge of these production lines. We need to make sure that any waste that we're producing that isn't useful is excluded from this economy. And any waste that we are producing, ultimately, they end up back, of course, in terrestrial ecosystems. We should be making sure that they are in some way useful to the land, if not good for the land and that improve soil health. That ambition, that vision is some way off yet, but that's where we should be headed. We should be tweaking our production lines so there aren't any wastes that aren't useful for soil health or harmful to soil health. So what we're heading towards, and I think that this is the expression teaching your grandma to suck eggs. Everybody in this room knows more about this than me, really. Natural circular economies are where wastes are used as resources, sustainable material resources, in order to produce products, and then of course we consume those products. So rather than the linear economy, if we look to natural ecosystems, we can see, and of course we are part of nature, so we have to remember this, we can see that it is a circular economy naturally, and we can identify lots of different circular economies and ecosystems that operate in this fashion and operate very successfully with a lot of production and a lot of consumption. So for us, if we translate it to human society, then our circular economy looks a bit like this, rather than being linear. Waste, and I put it in these inverted commas, which I always do, because really, once we detoxify the economy and remove harmful elements, reduce persistent organic pollutants, etc., then all of waste should be usable, ideally, as I say, that's where we're headed. Then we have this ecological model, this circular economy that works for us. Of course, it can't be propped up by fossil fuels. We're transitioning to use renewable energy. And once we use renewable energy, then this is equivalent to a mature ecosystem, which is a circular economy. What I'm proposing in the purpose of my talk is to introduce the concept of putting soil at the heart of this circular economy. So of course, there are lots of issues that we're tackling, the plastics, etc., that we've talked about, that are big issues across the globe, both in oceanic systems and land-based systems. But if we don't put soil at the heart of the circular economy, I don't believe that we'll achieve a true circular economy. So the soil bio-based ecological model that I would propose is something we should
Alo,
working
Pia.
towards.
Không ngồi đấy.
Will you please mute your microphone,
Chưa
please?
sao? Thầy nhắn em bây giờ thầy mới sang, tại vì không thấy em trả lời em thầy không sao.
Thầy hẹn với cả Etiban chưa?
Chưa, cứ sang gặp thôi, cần gì phải hẹn, hay phải hẹn trước.
Thầy không hẹn thì ông làm sao có ở bureau được?
Ok, nếu vậy thì thôi thì thầy viết email rồi.
Can
Xong rồi
you
có gì chiều thầy
please
sang.
mute your microphone?
Thế nhá.
Thầy
Then all
lên
of you
web
please
của Licap
mute your
xong là
microphone.
gọi cho office của ông ấy, xong là nói chuyện với ông ấy, xem là lúc nào ông kia ở đấy.
Ok, thế được rồi, cảm ơn nha. Để con cho
Apologies. What's that? Mute all. There's a button, mute all. Mute all. Sorry.
No, that's fine. It's all learning for me.
Learning by doing. Thank you.
Yeah.
Off we go.
Apologies for the pause. So what we're wanting to do is put soil at the heart of our ecological model, our circular economy. So it's called an ecological model of delivering sustainable development because it is based on an ecosystem, a mature ecosystem where wastes are used as resources. So if we put soil in the middle here at the heart of the circular economy, thanks, then if all the wastes that we're producing are either not harmful for soil, if they're to be returned, they don't do any harm, but hopefully we can modify our production lines so that they are actually useful for soil. Now that's a big ask, that's a big, huge amount of work to do, but ultimately everything is ending up in the soil. So this is what we should be doing if we're not going to cause soil degradation as we are at the moment. Then that waste stream, if it's not being used as a resource to make something else that is sat on top of soil, is going back into soil and rebuilding soil. And then the soil, I would argue, is actually a source of future resources. So at the minute we make our plastics from fossil fuels, of course, we make a lot of materials from fossil fuels. If we actually move towards treating the soil as the engine house powered by the sun that it is for a whole suite of bio-based resources, then we can change our economy with put soil at the heart of the circular economy. So when I say bio-based resources and a bio-based ecological model, these are early thinkings about this, but there are companies around the world, mainly in the US, Brazil, Japan, that look in soil for new genes, new microbes. It's called bioprospecting. Actually, we're taking a very synthetic biology approach to that. If we actually look at the whole microbiome and work with the microbiome to create the right environment in the soil, then there's a potential to get so much more out of the soil. Soil contains the next antibiotic that we want to look at. Soil contains all sorts of genes and proteins, programmable bio-based materials that could be the base, and indeed are starting to be the base of a very profitable, sustainable new industry, which comes from the soil. So finding our organic molecules in the soil for agri-tech, for health tech, possibly for organic computing, all sorts of issues. So this is what I would say is that we have to put soil at the heart of our ecological model. Now, taking a step backwards in order to look at what is governing soil health ultimately. This is my understanding as not a biologist, as an environmental engineer of what the 6 kingdoms of life are. And you'll notice that 3 of those are to do with microbes. And any microbiologist listening to this will be, yes, you know this, microbes are really important. And I think it's worth pointing out that if we look at the balance of species on Earth, and we zone in on this, we can see that that you are here, if you see in the top right-hand corner, the fungi, animals, and kin is that tiny green section in the biological diversity map there that's blown up into the circle of eukaryotes. And it's a tiny proportion of life on Earth. If we look then at the fact that most of this life is bacterial, or microbial rather, it's estimated that 99.99% of all microbial species are currently unknown to science. Now, these mainly live in the soil. Hence the reason why the soil, if we put soil at the heart of the circular economy, and we start to value soil and look after soil and reverse the 50 years of soil degradation that we've had so far across the world, then we can start to harvest from soil these bio-based materials. We're nurturing the farm, as it were, that is producing these species. And it's Tom Curtis, who the people from Newcastle know and might have been involved in supervision of some people, that told me that there's 10 to the 13 bacteria in a ton of soil. Now, soil is a very competitive place for the microbiome, and so the births and deaths equal each other. And if I can anthropomorphize it, it's 1 in 300. So there's births and deaths all the time, happening all the time, and 1 in 300 of these new born bacteria will have a mutation. And I think it's 1 in 300, and the birth rate equals the death rate on a daily basis. Then that's something like 10 to the 11 new mutations in soil every day. That means most of those mutations are going to be not important, but some of those new mutations are going to produce metabolites, chemicals, bio-based materials, new genes that are the solution to future problems on Earth. I'm not wholly saying that synthetic biology is the only solution to our future problems on Earth, but it's very exciting, the potential of biotechnology, if we make sure that the soil environment for receiving those synthetic biological preparations is the right environment for the microbiome. So if we look at those kingdoms, the 6 kingdoms that we mentioned, which has the biggest control on planetary health? At the minute, you might think it's us. We look at the plastic waste in the oceans, we look at the plastic waste in the terrestrial ecosystems and all the other wastes that are causing problems for life on planet Earth. You might think it was us, but we evolved 7 million years ago. And the Anthropocene is the only time that we actually started to have an influence on the planet. So let's look at when plants evolved. 500 million years ago, plants have a big effect on planetary health, as we know, with the planktons in the oceans to the Amazon rainforests, controlling or having a big controlling input on our atmosphere. But actually, if we go back 3.5 million years ago, that's when the microbiome, bacteria, first evolved. So it was no surprise to me when I read a paper in 2020 written by Rothamsted, our soil experts in England, that it's the soil microbiome that is actually responsible for building soil, literally releasing extrapolymeric substances that stick together silt, sand, and clay particles to create shelter for itself, and also the right redox environment so that they can utilize the chemicals that they want to produce food and access water. A really important paper, 2020, written in 2020 by Andy Neal and colleagues. So microbes first evolved 3.5 billion years ago, soils 3 billion years ago. Soils are, really do need us to pay attention to. They're not very glamorous, but they underpin all terrestrial life. Microbiomes control planetary health, whether those are microbiomes in the oceans or microbiomes in our forests or in the soil, and they're all interlinked. So we need to start paying attention to the microbiologists and start working with them and start employing them like we're starting to do at Durham University. And again, my colleague Tom Curtis at Newcastle says soil, not space, is the final frontier, which obviously I'm a fan of because I'm into soil. So I want to tell you where we're at with soil at the minute, and then come back to the concept of putting soil at the heart of the circular economy. So at the moment, we're in a vicious cycle of soil degradation with climate change. We have climate change causing extreme weather events, which combined with poor soil management, the industrialized agriculture that we've seen over the last few decades, has led to biochemical and physical and microbiological degradation of the soil. because soil is the biggest store of organic carbon after fossil fuels, that's of organic carbon, then that leads to more climate change. And in fact, if you look at since industrialization, 2/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions have come from fossil fuel use, but 1/3 of all global greenhouse gas emissions have come from the land. And year on year, it's 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions is our industrialized agriculture. So this vicious cycle leads to about 3 million tons of topsoil in the UK lost every year. I've got a little asterisk there because that's likely to be an underestimate. And also, we also landfill 100 million tons of subsoil at the moment. That's 58% of everything we landfill. We actually put into landfill, which creates methane emissions. 58% of those of landfill waste that we put into landfill is subsoil. So 100 million tons. So subsoil is basically clay, beautiful material to rebuild soils and reverse soil degradation. So this is the vicious soil, water, climate change cycle that we're in at the minute. Some of the work that we're doing at Durham University with partners across the world is rebuilding soils. This is an example of some pot trials that we looked at rebuilding basically sand. So 20% of African soils are effectively sand. In this case, in the Cape Flats community just outside of Cape Town, which is an informal settlement, it literally is windblown sand that's coming from the beaches. And what we've done here is we've added 25%. This is a huge amount to add. That's because it's sand, basically. So we're building a soil from scratch. We wouldn't add this amount to temperate soils, but in some cases, these are the amounts of waste material that we would add to the soil. And I've got some slides to show you the sorts of wastes that we would be reusing later. So 25% water treatment residual, that's down soil. This is a clean iron oxide waste from the water treatment industry. So anywhere you've got urban settlements, then you have drinking water treatment usually, and this waste is commonly landfilled. It's actually great in conjunction with organic matter, here compost, to rebuild your soils. And you can see that the one that has got the biggest growth is the one that we've got the co-amendment. Now we've got other samples where we can show that a single amendment versus a co-amendment, the co-amendment is always better. And the reason for that, if we go to the next slide, is we can see in this graph here on the y-axis, we're measuring the total plant mass. So of course it's of interest to farmers to get a big mass, a big yield for their crop. So we can see that the taller these columns, the bigger the mass. And then we've got the different types across the bottom. The letters refer to whether there's statistically significant differences. And you can see that the white column is the control. And we can see that the co-amendment is statistically significantly higher, both at 10% and 25% than the control. And it's also bigger than the equivalent compost amendment at 12.5% rather than 10%. Now, the reason why we think this is working is because we are providing the soil microbiome with the materials it needs in order to create the right soil structure for the microbiome to be happy. Now, that's quite useful for us because if the microbiome is happy, then it's going to produce a healthy crop, which is an ecosystem service that the soil provides. The other ecosystem services are things like carbon storage, water storage, which of course help with climate change mitigation and addressing some of the other SDGs. So if we provide the right materials, particle sizes, as well as micronutrients that might be missing from the microbiome because of the 50 years of soil degradation that we have experienced, then we can allow the microbiome to rebuild soils. So what we want to aim to get to is this virtuous soil water cycle with climate change, where we use wastes. And this is where I would urge our engineers that we're teaching to make sure that their production lines are producing things that can either be reused by other industries or products, because they'll end up in the soil, that are good for soil health. This is a product because this is an economy, a proper green economy, not just energy. that is ready to flourish and take over and run the circular economy, bioprospecting from soil. So we combine the waste to rebuild soil health. It's not a panacea. We need to consider the pollutants in these waste streams, of course, particularly in the organic waste streams where we've got antimicrobial resistance genes, etc. But this is not insurmountable. The sorts of minerals that we're using, which are redox active minerals, are capable of polymerizing organic molecules and meaning that we won't be able to have these AMR genes entering our water treatment, entering our water systems, etc., or our crops. And also stabilize SOC, stands for soil organic carbon. If we rebuild our soils, then we get the ecosystem service provision. Now, this has to be locality specific, so whatever communities need. We need to think about what wastes are available locally, although we do, of course, at the minute think of nothing of shipping huge containers of chemical fertilizers, so we do need to open our mind to actually, if we put soil at the heart of the circular economy, it's not necessarily a problem once we're using renewable energy to ship things across borders. But at the minute, while we haven't transitioned to renewable energy, we need to think about fossil fuel emissions. So locally available resources, build the soil, get the locality specific ecosystem service position that we want, and promote soil as a driver of a bioeconomy, true green economy. That's going to mean cleaner water reaches our aquifers, cleaner, less water reaching water treatment works. The water industry are not very popular in the UK at the moment. Anybody in the UK will be smiling because we know that they have been discharging sewage to our rivers and the seas in order to maximize profits. But the water industry aren't the enemy. The water industry have a big problem with biosolids. They need to be able to return biosolids to the land. And it's of interest to the microbiome, the soil microbiome, to have that organic matter which came from the land return to the land. Denmark returns all of its organic matter to the land for that reason. That's going to lead to less soil degradation, less climate change, and less flooding, which is going to mean that we can rebuild soil health. So here's another diagram, kind of saying the same, just to reiterate the point that there's this link. Here we can see the fact that our soils can be, at the top, we're showing where the atmosphere is. Our soils can be blown away when we've got unhealthy soils. At the bottom, our soils can be washed away. And this diagram comes from a paper we published in 2022, which turns Roosevelt saying a nation that destroys its soil, destroys itself on its head. It says a nation that rebuilds its soil can rebuild itself. And just to remind you that we are losing topsoil at an unsustainable rate. This is just UK figures. So soil is living. This is a message that is, I can't emphasize, is so important to get out there. I don't just mean there's living things in the soil. Soil itself is living. And I came across this paper in 2020 that I've mentioned already by Andy Neal and colleagues at Rothamsted, where they talked about soil as an extended composite phenotype. Now that was a term, not being a biologist, it didn't mean anything to me. So I'm assuming that if you're not a biologist, it doesn't mean much to you. A nice way to think about it is whether or not you are a fan of birds. If I show you a picture of a wren's nest and then show you a picture of an eagle's nest, whether you knew about wrens or eagles, if you could read the scale on that or see the scale, you see that that's a small bird's nest and a big bird's nest. And you would know that that bird had affected its environment. It had engineered its environment in order to create something that it needs. That is an extended composite phenotype of the wren and of the eagle. So another example is a beaver with its dams. This is a picture not from one of our papers, but a lovely paper which has an ESEM image of an aggregate in soil. And the picture on the right-hand side is showing the construction of this aggregate and how it has been constructed by the soil microbiome in order to create the right channels to deliver oxygen and release other gases from the microbiome according to what the microbiome wants. So this is a picture of a soil aggregate from a healthy soil where the microbiome has constructed, and it says, used its extrapolymeric substances to stick together silt, clay, and sand, the 3 particle sizes that geotechnical engineers would talk about in soil. in order to create the right microenvironments that deliver the right chemical environment for life for that microbiome. And of course, there are the 10 to the 13 different species, different bacterial cells in soil and lots of different bacterial species. It's a competition, and it's an arms race all the time, as we know. But this is the extended composite phenotype of the soil microbiome. And basically, again, to labor the point, this is our extended composite phenotype. This is our shelter that we build. And if that shelter gets squashed, compressed, flattened, then we get quite upset and we're not able to go out and get our food and our water, etc., in the way that we do. For the soil, this is what we do to the soil. This is what we've done. We leave it bare so it doesn't have the source of energy input from the sun. The plants have a symbiotic relationship with the soil microbiome, and the plants photosynthesize and deliver about 20 to 50% of their carbon that they make in photosynthesis to the microbiome in a healthy soil, in return for the microbiome taking nutrients from the minerals that the plants can't access, usually through the mycorrhizal fungi networks, and delivering them to the plants. So it's a two-way exchange. Of course, I could talk for hours about that. We have destroyed that relationship. So if we want to rebuild that relationship, that plant-soil microbiome, which is important for crop science as well, because now we're understanding, going back to the evolutionary slides, that plants aren't in charge of everything. Plants might be in charge of some things. It's a mutual relationship, but the soil microbiome switches on a lot of plant genes. So when we're developing new crops, we need to be aware that the soil microbiome is governing what genes are doing. So what does living soil need? Living soil, in order to deliver the ecosystem services that it does for itself and then coincidentally for us, needs material inputs. It also needs energy inputs. So the energy inputs is the sun. That's what powers the soil. Of course, fossil fuels came from the sun. But the material inputs, we have cut off the supply of minerals. We've cut off the supply of water often from soil because we've built our dams, we've built our urban infrastructure, which extends out into rural economies. So we need to make sure that there's nothing missing from the microbiome, because the flooding that happens of rivers naturally that feeds the soil again and replaces the zinc that is taken out by the plants is being mined in many of our soils, particularly in Africa where the soils are so ancient, and particularly with industrialized agriculture. So that's what we're doing by adding the wastes. We're putting these material inputs back into the soil. We are then seeing these gaseous waste, aqueous waste, solid waste. This is just, this is an engineer's perspective of an input-output system. Obviously, these gaseous wastes are controlling the planetary health. And the services that we get delivered from soil are nutrition, health, shelter. This is a service for the microbiome, thermal comfort, etc. And then it's for us, because and we can tweak the waste that we add to soil if we are like, okay, we want nutrition from this soil, or we want carbon storage, or we want biodiversity or flood resilience. We have to balance that. So the waste that we would be using for this, the waste that we are using for this, and that I would advocate everybody needs to do around the world in order to put soil at the heart of not just the circular economy, but in the next green revolution in a green economy, are things like water treatment residual. So as I say, every urban environment has water treatment. So they produce a mineral byproduct, which is iron and aluminium oxides from their clean drinking water system. And they also produce sewage, and they have a sewage treatment system where they'll produce organic matter. This is actually an example of compost, but it could just as likely be biosolids and or cattle manure, depending on the context. These two things together are the constituents of soil. So soil is largely made up of minerals, about 45%, about 5% organic matter, and then the rest is air and water in a healthy soil. So we're basically, developing technologies to rebuild soil from scratch. If we look at a transmission electron micrograph here of these two different things, If we look at the water treatment residual, which I mentioned was iron oxides, aluminium oxides, you can see the clay platelets there, to get your eye into that scale, 50 nanometers. The boxy rectangular platelets, which are the clay minerals. The black kind of tram lines on there are iron oxides, and the clay minerals are silicates, aluminium and aluminium silicates. And the minerals, or the black that's showing up as black, is the iron oxides and manganese oxides and aluminium oxides that are stuck onto the clays because of the relationship chemically between clay and aluminium oxides and manganese oxides, iron oxides. The image on the right, B, is a TEM of humic matter. And so you can see that it's more blobby. It hasn't got that mineralogical structure of the clay platelets, but you can see as well the same black iron oxides, aluminium oxides that are stuck on the surface of the humic matter. And that is why the two materials together, the minerals and the organic matter, work to build soil structure, because it's what the microbiome needs. It sticks the clay to the iron oxides, to the organic matter. And that's the soil architecture that we need. The other important point to make is that the minerals that are present in some of the wastes are fantastic for stabilizing carbon in the soil and also polymerizing and immobilizing potentially toxic, persistent organic pollutants, as well as potentially immobilizing potentially toxic elements, because they're redox active. So manganese is actually a very strong oxidant, capable of, it's what's actually in photosystem 2 and breaks down water into oxygen, and it's present and circulated very readily in soil because it doesn't really come out as a solid in the same way as iron does as a sulfide. So it's constantly cycled between anoxic and oxic zones and is a major part of the carbon cycle in terms of stabilizing carbon. So just recently we published a paper. This is with colleagues at Leeds University, Caroline Peacock, and others on the mineral carbon pump. It took us a long time to get this paper published. It kind of came out of the work that me and Tom did together a long time ago, where we first talked about carbon being stabilized in manganese oxides. Now we've finally published a paper which shows the mechanism for how, as well as the biological carbon pump, which is plants stabilizing carbon, and pumping it into the ground. There's a microbial carbon pump. We didn't publish on that, but we published on the one on the left, the mineral carbon pump. Basically, the minerals can polymerize light molecular weight organic molecules into humic substances, basically. Therefore, stabilizing that carbon in the soil, which is addressing climate change mitigation. So, to summarize, as I say, a nation that rebuilds its soil rebuilds itself. And what we want to do, and what the group of people that I'm working with are doing, is looking to drive forwards a reversing soil degradation agenda, reversing 50 years of soil degradation that we've undertaken, that we sleepwalked into. We were like, oh, we can feed the world, this is fantastic, but that was before we understood about the synergistic relationships between plants and soil microbiome. So we're driving toward this soil is living agenda. We actually surveyed 4,000 children and found out that they didn't know that soil was living, and they didn't know that climate change and soil are linked. And this is not surprising, of course, because adults don't know it either, because we're not teaching anybody yet. And this is really scary for the future, since soil is the biggest store of carbon after fossil fuels. So we also have large ambitions on education as well, working with primary and secondary, as well as tertiary education facilities. So this is UK centric. Sorry, I didn't put it into a global context, but in the UK, we have 100 million tons of organic matter and 150 million tons of mineral waste, which are, from what I can see in my testing and analysis, suitable for rebuilding soils. At the moment, we're busy saying, oh, we've got 100 million tons of organic waste. Oh, we could make some pharmaceuticals from it. Instead of looking at the fact that it has come from the soil. And okay, you can put carbon back into the soil with a biological carbon pump, but plants, but you can't put the micronutrients back in. You know, we can't put every micronutrient back in. It's just not economically feasible to mine all those nutrients. It's just not practicable. It's much more sensible to put them in the form that the plants want, in the form of organic matter. So combining these organic matter wastes with these mineral wastes, which are largely what around the world we actually put into landfill, is going to allow us to reverse this soil degradation and open up opportunities for green economy. So the green economy at the minute, if you say it to anybody, they think of energy. Energy is incredibly important, but at the moment, energy and soil are vying for the same organic rich wastes, and soil is losing out every time. And that's my ambition, is to correct that. There's a huge £10 billion, I think I should say $10 billion industry that was valued in 2019, just before COVID, in agritech in the States. I think there's potential for agritech and health tech and other bio-based materials as we move towards using more bio-based materials. It's really important to emphasize locality-specific ecosystem service provision, i.e. rebuilding our soil using locally available wastes and for the communities that need to use those soils. And working with communities and social scientists on this is very much part of this agenda. So the soil microbiome is central to soil health, central to SDG 15. And I just want to introduce, I think that you've had a talk before on the One Health concept. I sort of tweaked it a bit to talk about the microbiome One Health concept, talking about planetary health for us, for animals, being dependent, of course, on plant health. We know that we are wanting to move towards plant-based diets because we understand that that's going to be better for the planet. Also, it's better for our gut microbiome. But that is all underpinned by microbiome health. So it's about time we started paying attention to this ecosystem, which evolved way before we did, and start looking at what material and energy inputs are required for it. And the final slide is just to re-emphasize, we need to put soil at the heart of our circular economy. If we put carbon and minerals back into the soil, then we can use the soil not only to deliver ecosystem services like holding onto the water, so we don't have the droughts, we don't have such severe droughts and wildfires and floods that we've been having, or we can handle them better, but also that we are using the soil as the engine house that it is for, that it should be for a green economy.
Thank you very much. Wonderful. Stop. Just a moment, please.